All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Allan Bevere. Dr. Bevere is a pastor and theologian who has written on the relationship between the church and politics. His 2011 book, The Politics of Witness, explores how Christians on the political left and right have compromised their values by embracing Christendom and what it means for the church to witness to the rest of the world. This book has had a profound impact on my thinking and remains deeply relevant today. We will be discussing this book and Dr. Bevere's perspective on the show today. Dr. Bevere, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Well, I was telling you before the show that I read this book in 2011, not long after it came out. I was still in Bible college, finishing up my degree in biblical studies, and this just had a huge impact on the way that I thought about the church and its political witness to the world. And it was, in a lot of ways, a synthesis of like a lot of New Testament scholarship that was dealing with these issues at the time. And it's very readable and very approachable. So I'm excited to talk to you about it today. I also think it's extremely relevant as well, as we're going to see in the show. But before we get into any of that, just talk to us about yourself, your background, and your work.
Sure. I am a United Methodist pastor. I was United Methodist pastor for 38 years, and I retired from that in July of 2022. I have been an adjunct professor at Ashland Theological Seminary in Ashland, Ohio, for 30 years, taught in the area of theology and ethics and biblical interpretation. I did my PhD work at Durham University in Durham, England, and did some work at Duke Divinity School with Stanley Hauerwas, who was my advisor for my Master of Theology degree. And of course, if you read The Politics of Witness, you can hear Hauerwas in the book because I was very much influenced by him. So I am now retired. I am continuing to write and continuing to have a presence on social media. I publish a Substack, and am currently working on another book, and probably need to do an expansion of the book, The Politics of Witness, which I've said I've always wanted to do and just haven't done it yet. So that's what I teach pastors overseas. I teach in Cameroon and Zimbabwe and Cuba, trying to get theological education to these pastors who are doing wonderful work in difficult and limiting situations. So that's basically what I do.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. A long and prolific career. And this book that you published, it came out 14 years ago, I guess now. And obviously, politics in the United States was a lot different then in many ways, but then also very much the same. And so even though this book was written at a different period of time, almost everything you say in the book remains deeply relevant for today. But I'm curious, like in 2011 was really interesting because and I think about this time a lot. This was really kind of like the heyday of anti-imperial readings of Paul and the New Testament more generally. And there was a lot of literature that was published on this. And as I was going through like my degree in biblical studies, I was exposed to a lot of this, what at that time was cutting edge scholarship. And so it was very popular, but your book does kind of chart a different course, in that it's not strictly an intellectual book, but it's also designed to help guide the church in a certain direction. Like you want Christians to read this and have it change their perspective on the witness of the church to the world. So going all the way back to 2011, what motivated you to write that book, and how has your thinking about some of the major themes of this book developed over the last 14 years?
Yeah, well, the anti-imperial reading was important, and that I think that was part of the motivation. I actually did write an essay in a book for InterVarsity that Scott McKnight co-edited called "Jesus is Lord, Caesar is Not," and that I wrote on Colossians in Philemon, and the thesis there was that anti-imperial reading is there, but it's kind of overblown, that we've overblown it, and that we just need to be careful about that. And so it raised just a lot of questions about the church and politics. So what I think what I did in The Politics of Witness is my thesis, if you will, of the book was, it's not a question of whether or not the church will be political. The church is political. It's a question of how it is political. And so what I was poking at was the idea that the church is its own politic, with its own integrity. And it's not that we rule out, the channels of democracy that we work in, that we don't, do the kinds of things everybody else does, but there's something different about us. And that if we don't hang on to that difference, if we don't understand our identity as to who we are as citizens of the kingdom, we end up compromising what I would say, our ecclesiology, and we undermine the politics of who the church is, because we're busy acting like everybody else.
Yeah. No, I think that that's a really important insight. And you kind of, so like, just thinking about where we were back then, like just of the major arguments that are in that book, have you changed your thinking on any of these issues, or have you just continued to kind of like, refine and develop them as the years have gone on?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because as I've said before, one of the interesting things is that I've had the response to the book was from people, it was very positive for the most part. And people said they enjoyed it and it helped them think differently about things, but they wish there was more. So I've been saying for years now, I need to write an expansion of that. So I would certainly keep the same thesis, that the church is a politic, that our primary politic is to witness to the truth of the gospel and everything that includes, which is a lot: justice and mercy and righteousness. And that I would continue that. But I would do a couple of things. I would add a couple of things. One of the things that I would do is I would add a chapter on seeking the common good. That even though we Christians have this unique place, we still live in communities where not everybody has our convictions. But we must work together and seek the common good, and we can do that, by the way, without compromising our witness. And I've been thinking about this because I've been influenced the last few years a lot by Miroslav Volf and some of his work on the common good, and some others. And so I think that is one of the things that I would do differently. The other thing I would do differently is I would make a distinction between conservative and right, and liberal and left. That what I think we're seeing now with our current politics, as it has evolved, is it's become very clear that the left-right continuum really refers more to a way of governance that is not necessarily conservative or liberal. So you can be, I've argued today in some of my work that the MAGA movement is not conservative. It's right. It's right wing, but it's not conservative. And there's also those on the left who are left wing, but they're not liberal, and that these mean different things. And so I would actually spend some time working on that. I would flesh out more what Jesus is doing in the Gospels. I would spend more time dealing with the temptation story as a text that helps inform us as far as what Jesus is asking us to do and insisting we do if we follow him. Probably would deal more with certain texts of the New Testament, like Romans 13, 12 and 13, and do some things in Revelation. I'm actually writing a book on Revelation right now, just some essays. And I would think that that's what I would do is bring out some texts to display what it is that I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And again, I think all of that would be extremely helpful. But the main contours of your book are timeless and evergreen. And it's what we should be thinking about as Christians, just as we reflect upon how we engage with the wider world. I think you've laid a really good foundation for what we're going to be discussing in the rest of the show today. And you really identify in the opening of your book the two problems that have, at least for the last 1700 years, plagued the Christian church. And that's the idea of Constantinianism and then the Christendom that emerged out of that during the Middle Ages. So talk to us about both of those contexts, or both those concepts. When we use the term Constantinianism, what do we mean by that, and how does that lead to Christendom?
Yeah, the way that I use those terms, and some people use them together as synonyms, but I think they're different. Constantinianism refers to the idea that Christian. So Constantinianism, yeah, Constantinianism is the belief that we Christians have a duty and a right to rule, and we made a deal with Constantine back in the fourth century. You know, it's real interesting if you read some accounts of that. The bishops, they weren't sure what to make of this, because they liked the idea that they weren't going to be persecuted any longer, but they were a little skittish about the idea of that kind of having that kind of power. But that's the idea, and we have modeled that ever since for 1700 years. Christendom is what I call the vestiges of Constantinianism. We see it in America. We see it in Europe. When you go to England, for example, street names are names of saints or famous people. Towns are named after various figures in Christian history. And we do things like open up prayer at town councils and things like that. So Christendom is the vestiges of Christianity. Christendom and Christianity are not synonymous. I think that's very important, because you could, for example, in many countries, in Germany, still true today, your baptism is connected to the state, right? German clergy are paid by the state, the Lutheran Church, the official state church. So Christendom is the vestiges of all of this. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily
right.
Christian.
And one of the
So if I could add. I was going to say, if I could add to that, just to make the point clear, people talk about America being a Christian nation, for example. I always qualify that and say, no, it is not a Christian nation. It is a nation that reflects Christendom. And that's different.
And at its heart, Christendom is really all about the appropriation of political power for the benefit of the church, right? That's really what that term represents. Yeah. Yeah, and what's ironic,
right.
and you point this out in a chapter in your book, what's ironic about that is that, with Constantine, the Western church kind of fell into that trap of wanting to use political power in very much a worldly way, and thinking that maybe the kingdom of God could be imposed upon society by force. And ironically, they were repeating all of the mistakes that Israel makes in the Old Testament. So in what way do we see kind of, obviously it wasn't Christendom, maybe Hebrewdom or whatever you want to call it, but in what way do we see this exact same paradigm working itself out in the Old Testament with Israel?
Yeah, I think that what happens in the Old Testament, and you can read the whole narrative in a way, that God in the first 11 chapters of Genesis is going big in a sense. He is working through the global population. You have the story of the flood, and then it finally ends with the Tower of Babel. The whole earth is of one language. And then after chapter 11, God basically says, well, this ain't working. So I'm going to choose. I'm going to start small. So he starts with Abraham, and he's going to found a nation. And this nation is going to be different. It's going to be different from all the other nations. And then they are going to be a light to the world and show the world the ways of God. Well, what happens in Israel's history is they end up looking more like the other nations. In 1 Samuel, when they want a king like all the other nations, and Samuel doesn't want to do that, God relents, lets them have a king. And by the time we get to the reign of Solomon, they get what they want. They look like the other nations. They've got a king who's an idolater, who has a harem. I mean, they don't look different, right? And so they go through exile and go through all of this. And so I think what you get then in the New Testament with the birth of Jesus is God saying, all right, I'm not working through nations anymore. I'm going to found a community. I'm going to found an alternative community that will be based on love and non-coercion and sacrificial acts. And the cross, of course, is the central thing that God does to demonstrate to us how God wants us to live in the world. The cross is not just about what God does for us, but it's also about how God expects us to live in the world. So Jesus is going to found this alternative community that's different from the nations of the world, including the nation of Israel. Well, by the time we get to Constantine in the 4th century, the church is beginning to do exactly what Israel did in the Old Testament, and become like the other nations. So we then, as Christians, identify less as Christians and more as Americans or Canadians. And somehow we then try to fit our Christian identity into that. Stanley Hauerwas likes to say that in the United States, Christians set out to make America Christian, and actually
Right.
Christians
That's a
became
great way of putting it.
Americans. So we're right, and so America, to be an American, and I would also argue for some Christians to be a Democrat or a Republican, is more determinative than what it means to be a Christian. Another way that I say it in the book is that the church is our nation. And this goes back to 1 Peter, where he says, quote, in the Old Testament, you are a royal priesthood, a holy nation. I mean, that's meant to be taken seriously. We are a holy nation. So I always say, when you fill out some kind of form or application and wants to know your nationality, I'm always half tempted to put church, because that's really who we are. And that's centrally who we are.
Yeah, and I mean, this idea really is central to the New Testament. And this is one of these things that when I preach and teach at my church, I find people having a really hard time grasping. But you have passages like Galatians 3:28, where Paul says that, in Christ there's no Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, and the entire point is that our identity as Christians is completely shaped by our faith in Christ, and that means that we're a part of a different group, and that kind of transcends all of our our national identities or our social identities. It's not that those things are completely irrelevant, but that's not really what matters. And I think so many Christians, is like you were saying, we care more about our identity with our nation or some other social status than we do about our identity as Christians, and that's a huge problem.
It is a huge problem. I say in the book, I quote, and I can't remember the theologian I quote, but basically says, the idea is what happened to Christianity, that in the Second World War, Christians, baptized Christians who were German and American and British, set out to kill each other. That when we did that, we were making a claim, and that is what it means to be German, what it means to be British, what it means to be American is more determinative for who we are than what it means to be baptized in the name of Christ. When you're willing to actually do violence against other brothers and sisters in the faith.
Yeah.
So that's, I go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. Finish what you're saying. Yeah, you're good.
Well, I'm just going to say that a couple, 3 years ago, my boys and I have twin sons, and they're 30 now. And we took a trip for about 4 days out to Gettysburg, and we did the battlefield thing and did town. But I said to them, the first day we were there, before we started doing anything, I said, here's a question I want you to ponder while we're here. And I'm not expecting an answer, but here's what I want you to ponder. And this is it. What happened to the church over 2,000 years that in this place, Christians killed Christians over the question of whether or not it was right to own other human beings? Now think about that for a minute, right? I mean, that's quite the transformation that we really don't think too much about, but I'm struggling to picture Jesus not wondering what happened.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And you deal with a lot of these you deal with some of the major historical turning points that led us to this place in your book. And we've already talked about, kind of Constantine and the shift that happened in the late patristic period that would impact, medieval Europe. And everyone's very familiar with the wars between, the early modern countries and everything like that. But in terms of the modern iteration of this, you really kind of tie this into the Enlightenment. And the claim that you make in your book is that the Enlightenment, like one of the goals of Enlightenment thinkers was to kind of rein in the power of the institutional church. But they also wanted to make sure that they could utilize Christianity as a way to propagate these new forms of political power that they were developing during that time. So talk about that dynamic. How was it that in a lot of ways, the Enlightenment thinkers who were trying to set the state free from the church actually wound up putting the church in service of the state?
Yeah, by the time you get to the 18th century, Europe has been a bloody battlefield for centuries. And it's Christians waging war on Christians. And so Enlightenment thinkers rightly understood that they needed a different approach because Christians were just killing everybody. And you get, actually, James Madison talks about this in his, I want to say maybe it's the Federalist Papers. He talks about this, that what the American experiment is about is trying to create a situation where you marginalize religion in a way that we don't end up with more bloodshed, because people are killing each other over doctrine. So, and which is true, doctrine and sacraments and baptism. What is interesting then is the Enlightenment then wants to make religious convictions, and here we'll talk Christian convictions. They want to make Christian convictions a matter of personal preference. They want to, the Enlightenment doctrine of emotivism, that my belief in Jesus or my belief in the Trinity is just a matter of my own personal preference. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing to ground it in scientifically or reasonably. Thomas Jefferson says it doesn't matter whether my neighbor believes in one God or 10 gods. It doesn't pick my pockets. It doesn't break my legs. So what? Okay. So the idea is we're going to marginalize all of that, make it a matter of privacy or just personal preference. But what we are going to do is we're going to draw on morals that the Bible teaches. The morals of Jesus, right? This is what Thomas Jefferson is big into, the morals of Jesus. But what the morals of Jesus really turns out to be for Enlightenment thinkers is just making Christians good citizens. I mean, this is not new life in Christ. You know, Paul says in Colossians, since you've been raised with Christ, live like it. That's not what they're thinking. They're thinking, be kind, decent. And so the purpose of the church is to instill civic virtue. So Ben Franklin, who's really big on this, tells the story in his journal where he goes Philadelphia. He was not a huge churchgoer, but he did go periodically. He went to a Presbyterian church in Philadelphia, and he wrote in his journal that he liked the pastor, he liked the preacher. He said, but the sermon, he said it was real clear he was more interested in making us good Presbyterians than good citizens. So the idea is the job of the church is to instill civic virtue. What I want to say about that is that in some ways, that is a different form of Constantinianism. It's a way of getting the church, enlisting the church in the state's business and promoting the state's business, while actually not getting to be in charge, but we promote what the state is doing. So that's also a form of Constantinianism and Christendom. It's interesting that for the Enlightenment folks, for Jefferson and Franklin are the two I think I single out in the book, is that for them that the task of the church is just to promote the virtues of the state. So it's kind of the same thing in different garb.
Yeah. And I think that that's been so kind of like deeply ingrained in our culture that many American Christians never stop and think that there is an alternative to this. And I remember that, I became a Christian when I was 15. So I was like going into my sophomore year of high school, and it happened over summer break. And I remember that first day of school when we had to stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance, like something was different about it. And I just didn't feel comfortable with it anymore. But again, I guess if you grow up in an environment where every single morning you put your hand hand over your heart, and you say you say the pledge, and God's in there, one nation under God, and this is what we believe, then it would be very easy for American Christians to just never stop and think about their like political commitments as followers of Jesus.
That's right. We are raised in a context not to question this. I was raised that way, and it took me going to college and having a Mennonite professor of religion who helped me start thinking about these things. But it's just something, and that's why you had mentioned when you preach on this, people are having trouble wrapping their minds around it. It's really hard when all of a sudden what has been just the norm and in the air of what it means to be a Christian, you've got somebody standing up there and saying, we've got to raise some serious questions about this.
Yeah. Well, and I want to talk about the position of the American church right now, because you did discuss this a little bit in your book. And obviously, in politics, it's true that things change, but things also stay the same. And there are always going to be some perennial questions that we're dealing with. But one of the central claims in your book that I completely agree with, and I agree with it when I first read it, and I thought you did a good job of articulating it, but it's the idea that the American Christian left and right are in a lot of ways a mirror image of each other. So just talk to us about that, and in what ways might the left and the right be more similar than people that just watch cable news as their source of consumption for politics might believe?
Sure. So basically, Christians on the left and right are more similar than they think. Now, they obviously disagree on certain issues and how best to do certain things, but in assumption, they carry a lot of the same things. They all believe in both sides believe in freedom of choice. They just differ as to where that choice should be. They believe that people have a responsibility to be a part of the society. They just differ as to where that's supposed to be. So, and they basically accept the what I'm going to call liberal assumptions of the Enlightenment, and that's liberal with a capital L, not lowercase l as in Democrat, but they accept the liberal assumption that human beings are primarily autonomous, that we're individuals, we can determine our own destiny, and we are first and foremost individuals, and then what it means to be in a community is secondary. So I'm who I am, whatever that might be, and then how I fit into the community is determined by who I believe I am, and the problem with that, it fails to recognize that who I am has already been given to me in my stories. My upbringing, where I was born, what kind of family I was raised in, my social economic status, my race, all of these things are actually what make us who we are, and we are communally formed already. So one of the great deceptions of modernism is that I'm my own self and I can determine my own destiny. So these are the kinds of assumptions that both sides operate with. And what ends up happening, by the way, is that the church, as this community of faith that models the kingdom in its witness, ends up being marginalized. It's not determinative for who we are.
Right. And that's where Christians can read through the Bible in church on Sundays and see these passages that speak about the nature of the church. I was reading 1 Corinthians this morning. And again, the opening passages in 1 Corinthians are all about God calling the church. Like it's this whole thing. And we just completely ignore that is the major theme.
Yeah. And so there's simple ways that I say this is how we do this, so that we reveal this, is that, so instead of instilling in our children from an early time, what do you think God may be calling you to do one day? We ask, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah.
Right? That's a modern individualist assumption. What do you want to be when you grow up? Instead of saying, what do think about how God might call you, how we instill these kinds of modern assumptions into the kind of the essence of who we are, that I think ultimately undermines the mission of the church. And I do think that the church in many ways, and I want to be careful here, because I do think there are churches doing great stuff, great ministry today, You can find that in a lot of places. But I do think because we have become politically engaged in the ways of the world, that we have undermined that witness. The other thing to say about this is that there is, and I don't care who you vote for and what your party is, there's a dark underbelly to politics. Yeah. There's always a dark underbelly when money and power is involved. And one of the things I suggest in the book, and I say, I know this is never going to happen, but I'm going to say it, and that I think a Christian who believes God has called them to that political arena, whether it's Congress or whatever it is, that should be a calling confirmed by the church, just like pastors are confirmed by the church, because there is a lot of things that are fraught in that, right. With temptations and difficulties. And so if you believe God has called you, you also better be a person of deep, abiding Christian character. And so that should be a calling that's confirmed.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think of just how, again, going back to your point that politics is a dirty game, I think about the way that American Christians, politics is extremely tribal, and people like to pick a team and they will ride or die with their team regardless of what policies they support. And one of the things that was so disappointing in the run up to the election, and I'm kind of and I guess just to show my cards here a little bit, like in terms of Christians and voting, I oscillate between the Anabaptist position that we probably shouldn't vote at all, which I know a lot of Anabaptists, and I have a lot of respect for them, and I think that there might be something to that. And then the perspective that my vote should always be a protest against like abusive forms of power. And I'm not really sure which one I land on, but I'm somewhere in between those two things. But I can also understand how people could reasonably vote for a particular candidate from a particular party for utilitarian reasons. They might say, well, this person is better than the other one. We don't have great choices, but we have to pick one. But it was just so sad to see Christians on the left and the right just wholeheartedly endorsing and embracing everything their preferred political candidate did, and then refusing to ask, some basic questions about whether or not those party platforms align with their Christian values. And I think that's so destructive of the church. And it's exactly like you're saying. It's a bad witness to the world. Like when they look at us, they shouldn't see these kind of petty partisan politics, and they should see a church that's willing to critically think about, okay, like if you're called to the dirty game of politics, maybe the church needs to step in and really counsel you through that.
Yeah. The late John Howard Yoder was asked many, many years ago if someone really ran as a Christian in the way he envisioned Christianity in his context, could that person be elected president? And he thought about it for a minute, and he said, well, it's possible they could be elected, but they surely would not be reelected. And, the idea is that you just can't, you can't do Christianity effectively in power in that kind of way. And so the other thing is, you talk about the tribalism. So the tribalism of our current politics, to me, reveals the fact how little Christians identify with the church as their forming identity, right? Let's be honest, that many Christians sitting in the pews are not being formed by the church. They're being formed by their preferred cable news channel, right? That's where they're getting their, let me say it this way, it's where they're getting their discipleship, or the different pundits that they read. And of course I read a lot of people too, but this is where they're being formed. So why would it be a surprise then that as Christians, our politics looks just like everybody else?
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And in your book, you spend I actually think you have, if I recall correctly, a chapter where you call out the American Christian left, and then you have a chapter where you call out the American Christian right. So I want to give you a second to talk about that in today's terms. So in 2025, where do you think that the Christian right in America has compromised their values, and where do you think the Christian left in America has most compromised their values?
Yeah, one of the things that I do point out to get into that, answering that question, is that is that both sides selectively use Christian convictions. So, right. So the left, the liberal Christians will say to conservative Christians, you can't use the Bible for your support of abortion. For abortion, you can't put those religious convictions on everybody else. But you do get people on the left will say, well, the budget of the United States should reflect a priority to the poor. Okay, wait a minute. Okay, I don't disagree that as Christians, the Bible tells us to be mindful of those on the margins, but you can't say to the other side, you can't force your religious convictions on people when you turn around and say, hey, we should tax rich people because, the Bible tells us we need to take care of the vulnerable. So you can't have it both ways, right? So this was my criticism of both sides. So what I would say is to start with the left, I think where the left needs to have some better conversation and think about it. I'm going to say Christians. We're talking about Christians now.
Yeah.
Is first of all, the abortion. I think abortion is a great tragedy and travesty. As Christians for centuries from the very beginning have not at all been comfortable with abortion. I want to be careful to say that doesn't mean I support some of the draconian laws that Republicans have made, because we've had a dozen women or so who have died because their pregnancies went south and they weren't able to get abortions. There's something about that that's not very pro-life to me. Okay.
Right.
So I would say that the left needs to have Christians on the left need to have a better conversation about abortion. This is an issue, as Michael Gorman, the New Testament scholar, says, it's really an issue of the unborn as neighbor and welcoming neighbor and how that works. Okay. So that's one area what I would say the left needs to do a little work. I think also the left is, I'm not so sure that, let me say it this way. You get people on the left who say we need to be concerned about the marginalized. We need to be concerned about social justice, to which I don't always say, why aren't the unborn social justice? Why aren't they people on the margins? Right. Okay, so that's right. On the right. I would say that there is not enough concern about the marginalized who have been born, like children and immigrants, for example. What we see happening now to the immigration community. Where you have people who are here legally. I was just reading a story today about 50 people who are innocent, who were here legally. They're now down in that terrible prison in El Salvador. And I want to say to the right, really, would Jesus approve of this? There's a lack of humanity here. And you need to think about, if you're going to be pro-life, you've got to be pro-life outside the womb as well. This is very important. Where I would say both sides compromise, but this has been a problem for 1,700 years, is our willingness to do violence. Yeah. And we are willing to do it as Christians on both the left and right. I think the Christian nationalism that we see now on the right is a terrible incarnation and distortion of the faith. But as I said to some of my mainline pastor friends a couple of weeks ago, Christian nationalism, mainline Protestantism has its own version, and a kindler, gentler Christian nationalism is still nationalism. Yeah. So we need to look at our own house too. So those are places where I would say, I think we could probably get into other places. But one of the things I want to say when it comes to Christian ethics, the Bible doesn't give us policy. The Bible doesn't tell us what America or Canada should do in reference to policy. That's just not what's happening. But what the Bible does is it gives believers a posture and a place to stand where we look at these issues, right? And so it's where we stand as we get into the nitty-gritty of everything. So it's not irrelevant, but it's not a one-to-one. It's not a straight line from the Bible to foreign policy or domestic policy. But for Christians, and this is where the bearing witness comes in. We as Christians, we have this posture of hospitality toward the immigrant. So we also understand that nations have to do things and control, immigration and have borders and all that. We know that. But we stand here to say to the state, hospitality and understanding that these people are created in God's image and that they matter to God. And I would say the same thing to the left on abortion. These unborn children matter to God. And again, there are difficulties in trying to hammer out a policy, but that's where we start. And the Christians, we remind the state of what God would like for the state to do.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I think one of the things that really got me thinking about this was the war on terror, like back in the early 2000s. Well, I guess the mid to late 2000s, started in the early 2000s. But I remember as I was getting older and starting to think about what the Bible had to say about all this, I had been brought up in an environment where everyone just supported the war on terror because we had to protect ourselves, and it was kind of something to celebrate. And I remember getting to a point where just like listening to the stories of what was going on in the Middle East in the news, I could understand why people would want us to fight over there if the narrative is it's for our protection. But I couldn't understand how so many Americans would just celebrate the death of people thousands of miles around the world. And so even if you believe that it's necessary, I don't think it's something that makes it right. If you're a Christian, I think that we should always be trying to sue for peace. And it used to be that, like, when I was thinking about this, the only like criticism of American foreign policy was coming from people that were on the left. But it seems like over the last 10 years or so, both the left and the right have kind of ignored, or, they'll pick conflicts they support and they'll pick conflicts they condemn. But to just say outright that we should be skeptical about, warfare and kind of a violent foreign policy, it seems to be off the table for Christians on both sides of the political aisle. And I just wonder if you've seen the same dynamic, because like that's one of the things that I address on the show, because we're obviously very anti-war. And I just don't like the idea of my tax dollars being used to bomb innocent women and children in third world countries. But a lot of Christians just don't even think about it. They don't even care,
Yeah. Both sides will give a pass to their own, right? We'll give a pass to our own. So, I mean, Barack Obama, he stepped up drone strikes in Afghanistan, big time, and, bombed. Not intentionally, but he bombed a wedding. They bombed a wedding one time, and you had very few people on the left expressing any concerns. Probably would have been more outspoken if it were George W. Bush. So we do tend to give more of a pass to our own. We tend to think that our own are more well-intentioned, are better intentioned. So as opposed to the other side. And so I think, yes, I think we just give that pass, and Christians need to step away from that. We can't be, when it's just like with when we started this conversation, talked about the anti-imperial scholarship that was present when George W. Bush was president. One of the things that motivated the one book I contributed to, and I had a conversation with Scott McKnight about it, is that the only time we see anti-imperialism rears its head is when we get a Republican president.
Right.
And then, and then when we get a Democratic president, all the anti-imperialists go back into the corner. And the purpose of the book was to say, wait a minute, imperialism is imperialism. And so we need to be able to stand as an alternative. And that's the other thing I say in the book, that the church is an alternative to the world. We are our very existence is an alternative to their ways. And we in America don't look like an alternative.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're a pastor and a theologian, so you straddle the line between the practical and the intellectual. And so you're really kind of in a unique position to answer this question. I just want to know, how do you think that the American Christian church goes about reclaiming its political witness now that there are so many people that have just completely bought into and by people, I mean Christians in particular, there are so many people that have just bought into the notion that their political identity is their primary identity. How do we go about helping to change people's minds? Like, how do we go about reclaiming and restoring this witness?
Well, it's going to happen in individual church communities. It's not going to happen on a big scale. Denominations aren't going to. Denominations have a stake in things staying the same. Now, my United Methodist Church, I mean, our Council of Bishops has made statements, and that's fine. I'm okay with that. But the real change happens on the ground in individual communities. It happens in conversation. It happens with pastors who are willing to broach these uncomfortable subjects, not necessarily in a sermon where people feel like they're a captive audience. Although my pastor, she does a wonderful job of approaching these issues in a way that I think is not off-putting. But churches need to be willing to have conversations. Before I retired, one of the last church I served, we started what we called Courageous Conversations, and they were a small group, so they were voluntary. And we did one on sexuality, we did one on race, and we did one on immigration. And it was a way for people to come together to have that conversation, to begin to listen to everybody, but also begin to put some facts on the ground about some of this, and to say, okay, how does the Bible inform us? How does the Bible help us think about these things? Those kinds of things. And also, by the way, ministry, individual ministry in the community. Do you have an immigrant community who needs help? Do you have, other people who need some kind of care, who are on the margins and who maybe are being left behind because of government policy or that kind of thing, stepping into that gap? So I would say that that's where it starts. It starts individually with pastors and with churches, but pastors need to lead the way on that.
Are you optimistic that we'll have that shift in our culture? Or do you think that we're going to continue down the same path that we've been on for the last couple hundred years?
I think I think in my lifetime, I'm surely not going to see it.
Right.
It doesn't mean there's not good things happening now, but I don't see. I mean, when people talk about, will there be a revival in America? I'm not even sure what that means, but somehow this turning, which is usually pretty vague. I just think that we're going to have to continue to look at the individual church communities. That's where we will see beachheads of the kingdom working. And I think that there's things that I do have hope for. I do think that there are some younger people and younger generations who don't like the way we're doing this. And I think there are some communities of younger people that are seeking to change it. But I also think along with that is that we get the great de-churching, right? So we have young people who are doing these things, but not doing it in the church because either the church wasn't interested or didn't want to do what they wanted to do. And so they found another way to do it. So until the church actually decides they're going to embrace this kind of kingdom work, it's going to be hard for the church to pivot in a sense. So I think we've got more decline to go. I think we're heading in the wrong direction, if you will. But I also not sure that's bad. I mean, I might add a chapter in my revision on exile and what exile means, and that if the church in America is some way in exile, in its own self-imposed exile, we also always have to remember that the Old Testament writers saw exile as the fault of the people of God, right?
Right.
It wasn't the Babylonians, right? It wasn't the Assyrians, right? And if we're in a self-imposed exile, then maybe what needs to come out of that whenever this is all over is a faithful remnant. So maybe the church really does need to get smaller before it can become more faithful to the witness of the kingdom.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Allan Bevere, it's been awesome talking with you today. I think that's a pretty great point to leave us with. You are in the middle of working on some new projects, and you said you're active on social media. So before I let you go today, just tell my audience, where can they find your work? Where can they find you on social media? And then what can they expect from you in the next couple of years?
Sure, I appreciate that. So the majority of my writing is actually online. I have a Substack, and I offer daily reflections on the daily lectionary. I also a couple post every week, one or two other kinds of posts on various things. Right now, I'm doing a series on the Nicene Creed because it's the 1700th year of the Nicene Creed. And I'm also doing a series on John Wesley's sermon because I'm a Wesleyan. So you can find that at my Substack. And the best way to do it is just to Google my last name, Bevere, Bevere, like Revere, but with a B, and Substack. And it's called Faith Seeking Understanding. And from there, you can find the other things that I'm involved with on social media and other places. I am working on a book now on some essays on Revelation as a way to help us understand what the book is saying and how to read it. It's not a commentary or anything like that. It's just a way to bring the meaning of the text out for today. And then I'm hoping maybe after that, I'm going to do exactly what I've been thinking to do, is that give a revision to the Politics of Witness and expand upon it, make it into more of a larger book, though not real large, but larger than it is.
Well, that sounds awesome, and I cannot wait to read those books when they come out. Thank you again so much for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you. This has been a pleasure, and I just appreciate the work that you're doing.